My name is Nojin Kwak. I'm the chair of the Communication Studies. And on behalf of the entire department, thank you for coming to the 2017 Howard R. Marsh Lecture. Today's event wouldn't be possible without our fantastic staff. So if you, all of you could stand up, please. Our calm study staff. Okay, give them a round of applause. Okay, thank you. In 1974, the department entered into an intellectually rewarding partnership with Howard R. Marsh, a alumnus and former Michigan journalist. Thanks to his generous bequest, the Howard R. Marsh Center for Study of Journalistic Performance was born. Marsh Center supports scholarly research on democratic functions of news media. Through this world-class center, we also have the Marsh Postdoc Fellowship and the Marsh Distinguished Research Fellows Program. The Marsh Endowment is truly the gift that sustains. Even after Howard Marsh was gone, his son Richard, or you may know him as a Dick, or even some people call him a Jew, that's his nickname, remained engaged and involved with our department and its mission. Today's lecture is somewhat bittersweet because Dick Marsh himself passed away earlier this year. But his ongoing generosity and his responsiveness to new proposals for how to pursue the department's core mission will continue to be felt in our department holds for generations. In 1994, the Marsh gifts were expanded to encompass the Marsh Visiting Professorship in Journalism. Each year, the department selects an eminent professional journalist to be the Marsh Visiting Professor who both teaches and conducts research projects at University of Michigan. We are absolutely thrilled to have Will Potter as this year's Marsh Professor. According to PBS, Will Potter goes where no other investigative journalist has gone, and that applies to both his research and his advocacy of civil liberties. He was the first journalist to be selected as a TED Senior Fellow, and his TED Talks have now been viewed nearly 4 million times. Good job. He has lectured at more than 200 universities and forums around the world, including Harvard Law School, Yale University, the House of Democracy, Human Rights in Berlin, and he was a Knight Wallace Fellow here in Michigan, at the University of Michigan. He's also one of our most popular instructors with full classes and full office hours. Raise your hand if you are in Professor Potter's class. What I said is true, right? He's really popular, great. He's well respected in the classroom. His writing and opinions have appeared in the world top media outlets, including the Washington Post, CNN, National Geographic, Le Monde, the Sydney Morning Herald, Vice, and Rolling Stone. His book, Green is the New Red, exposed how nonviolent animal rights and environmental protesters became classified by the FEI as the eco-terrorists. It is now available in total of 5 languages: English, Spanish, French, Serbian, and Italian. He will be talking about this very topic at today's Marsh Lecture, titled From Protesters to Terrorists, the Mechanisms of State Repression. Without further ado, please give a well welcome to Will Potter.
I think this guy works, so I should be okay.
Yeah.
You guys hear me all right? Oh, thanks, Adrian. Thank you all so much for coming out. Thank you, Noja, for the very kind introduction. I told my students who came with only a little bit of bribery for extra credit. And importantly to the department and to the Marsh family for allowing me to have this truly dream opportunity here at Michigan. It's been incredible and I'm happy to be here. So today I'm going to be talking about, exactly as Nojin described, how animal rights and environmental activists became, according to the FBI, the #1 domestic terrorism threat. And the way I became immersed in this issue is through my own journalism. I had begun working at newspapers and magazines since I was about 17, writing for the Dallas Morning News. I bounced around quite a bit because at the time the path to career advancement was going up steadily through bigger and bigger papers till I ended up at the Chicago Tribune. And I was covering shootings and murders and dead bodies in storage lockers, and it was all leaving me feeling horribly dark and depressed. It was not the type of work I went into journalism to do. I mean, I felt like I had no positive impact on the world at the end of the day as compared to when I started. And so I had a background in some different protest groups in college, and so I decided to go out leafleting with a group of animal protection activists, just hanging door knockers on people's homes against animal testing. I thought it'd be, one, a safe thing to do on a Saturday afternoon, and also the most involved I should be as a journalist in any type of advocacy work. And of course, I have just the absolute worst luck ever, and we were all arrested. I had never been arrested before. But the important part of that story was a couple weeks later, 2 FBI agents came to my home, and they knew all about where I worked and how my dad had to co-sign for our apartment at the time because I didn't have any money, and I had a Fulbright pending, and my girlfriend at the time had some PhD funding, and they said they could make all this go away unless I helped them by spying on protest groups. And they made a point of emphasizing, you have this upward career trajectory, you're doing everything right, just make it easier on yourself or you're going to be put on a domestic terrorist list. And this was only a few months after September 11th, and I didn't have any idea what that actually meant. And it scared the daylights out of me. If in a university setting like this, if you're studying past social movements in your classes, like I did, you read about these eras and you want to think, oh, I'm just going to have 2 middle fingers in the air, walk off into the sunset, show no fear, it's not going to bother me. And it just scared the daylights out of me. But when that fear subsided, I really became obsessed with this issue. By the way, that's me. I didn't get a proper mugshot that I can use on social media at the time. But I became obsessed with this issue of finding out how people could be threatened with the domestic terrorist list just months after September 11th for nothing but hanging up leaflets nonviolently. How animal rights and environmental activists, who in their history have never harmed a single human being, could be labeled by the FBI as the #1 domestic terrorism threat. Now, it's not just a rhetorical flourish when the FBI says that. It sends a very clear message when you have Osama bin Laden alongside an alleged fugitive animal rights activist on the FBI's most wanted list. Now, before I go any further, though, we need to talk about who is not labeled as the #1 domestic terrorism threat. That includes people like Joe Stacks, who flew a plane into an IRS government tax building in my former hometown of Austin, Texas, killing himself, in other words, a suicide bomber, for his political views. There's been the rise of a far-right militia movement in the United States. And of course, we can't talk about any of this without talking about the violence of anti-abortion extremists, right? Of murdered doctors, murdered nurses, all in the name of pushing their political agenda. These groups have also done things like send anthrax through the mail, create weapons of mass destruction, a long list of things that generally most people would identify as terrorism. But the FBI is not. As part of my research, I went through every FBI report that existed and all of their data sets to tabulate how groups are being classified. And what I found was that consistently, these right-wing groups are never labeled as terrorists. Instead, this is from a report from West Point, the military academy. Not exactly, a bastion of, anarchist, animal rights, environmentalist thinking, right? But still, they documented this 300% increase in violence by right-wing groups since the 1990s. Now, in just one period, the 3 years after September 11th, there were 283 injuries and 71 deaths, according to West Point, by these groups. Now, based on my research using the FBI's data sets, every single act of domestic terrorism except for one was the work of environmentalists and animal rights activists. So, we either have a dynamic where the FBI has no idea any of this is actually happening, right? Or they are intentionally downplaying this violence while exaggerating and inflating the nonviolent property crimes of environmentalists. So let's talk about who is labeled the #1 domestic terrorism threat. It has an entire spectrum, but it includes groups that have done illegal, underground, criminal activity like the Animal Liberation Front. This was an iconic moment in the early 1980s where the ALF stole this primate breeches out of a laboratory. His eyes were sewn shut in sight deprivation experiments. It was exposed to the public, the media ran with the story, it got all those experiments shut down. There's been, the environmental movement has made use of nonviolent civil disobedience in really innovative ways, doing things like tree sits and road blockades, locking their necks and body to things to stop logging equipment from cutting down forests. Groups like the Sea Shepherd Conservation Society have steered their small inflatable boats between the whalers' harpoons and the whales, literally putting their bodies on the line to stop violence. And then there actually have been serious criminal activity. This was a crime by the Earth Liberation Front, again, an underground clandestine group. They burned down the Vail Ski Resort because it was encroaching on the last habitat of an endangered lynx. Clearly illegal, potentially dangerous. I would never argue to the contrary. Yet, this entire scope, from the stealing animals to this, the most extreme, has never harmed a single human being. So, how did we get to the point where people who are putting their bodies on the line, locking themselves through concrete barrels to stop destruction, stop violence, are labeled as the #1 domestic terrorism threat? Where people like Timothy McVeigh, who according to the former head of Homeland Security in Pennsylvania, James Powers, is, quote, just very angry with the US government. The man responsible, for my students who might not recognize him, for the Oklahoma City bombing, the most dangerous act of domestic terrorism in US history pre-9/11. So to explain this, I started drawing a comparison with the Red Scare in the United States, where people were demonized and persecuted because of their political beliefs as being suspected communist. And at first it was kind of a cute comparison, right? It made for a good title for a book and a website, and I think most Americans intuitively got it. But increasingly I felt like the themes I was seeing in my work aren't just limited to that one specific era of US history, but can instead be extended far beyond that. And so in that spirit, I wanted to identify what I think are the shared elements stretching across historical periods of how this actually happens. And my journalism students know that, for reporters to compete with BuzzFeed and Upworthy and Vice and everything else right now, you got to have a sexy top 10 list, right? So I thought I would do 10 easy steps to turn protesters into terrorists. Now, the most important of those, step one, is you have to use the power of language. So how that worked in this particular case, in the early 1980s, the environmental and animal protection movements in the United States were growing very quickly and very boldly. You had widespread public support for even the more militant tactics, people getting arrested, locking their necks to things, blocking bulldozers. The LA Times described them as environmental warriors. Similarly, you had national organizations like PETA publicly supporting those more militant underground groups. So you had a unity within these social movements as well. All of that was a big red warning sign for the industries and corporations that were being protested. So what they had to do was to take a scene or an image like this and displace these political activists from their moral high ground, so that this is not an environmental warrior or a hero or even a vigilante or a criminal, which is accurate in some of the situations. They just made up a new word. They pulled it out of thin air in about 1985. A group of corporations and industry groups got together. They created this word eco-terrorism, and then they started using it. The problem was, if you remember in the early mid-1980s, most people were focused on terrorism in a very different way. This idea of eco-terrorism meant nothing, and they just kind of were dismissed. So over the next 20 some odd years, they kept using that language in media campaigns, or step two. An example of how this plays out is the Department of Justice sends out a press release as soon as protesters are indicted, and it says, animal rights group, 7 members indicted for campaign to terrorize company. Unfortunately, a lot of my colleagues in the press have used that language in headlines, like in the Washington Post. So in other words, before they even set foot in a courtroom, you already have the most powerful wording in our language right now being twisted against them. I would argue making it impossible to get any semblance of a fair trial. For the public relations or marketing students in the room, there's earned media, like this, right? And then there's paid media. And so when you can't get good earned media, public relations firms just go out and buy newspaper ads, like this one in 1985. Meet the world's newest terrorist. You have this kind of Steve Urkel, Williamsburg hipster kind of character, right? With big glasses and the black mask, an axe. I don't know why he has an axe, but it says, "Don't tolerate terrorism in America. Fur is for life." This is because animal rights groups were releasing mink from fur farms, just setting them free to save their lives. 20 years later, that same imagery is being used in a full-page ad in the New York Times, Washington Post, and USA Today, all bought anonymously by these corporations, saying that animal rights activists control Wall Street by holding it hostage. They never took hostages. This is through a protest campaign that was so successful it knocked a corporation off the New York Stock Exchange. Now, if this is confusing to follow, fortunately, there have also been New York Times ads with a flow chart. And so it's kind of like you remember 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon? Was that it? Okay, everybody remember? So if you want to understand how the Humane Society, the most mainstream possible animal protection group, is actually connected with terrorism, the flow chart says, I know it's small print, that members of the Humane Society, a VP of the Humane Society went to a group called the Humane League. The Humane League, and they spoke at their holiday party. Members of the Humane League were once part of another group called Hugs for Puppies. Stay with me, no joke. Hugs for Puppies were once part of another group called Stop Huntingdon Animal Cruelty Philadelphia. Members of SHAC Philadelphia were once part of another group called Stop Huntingdon Animal Cruelty, the National Campaign. 6 members of that national campaign were indicted on conspiracy to commit animal enterprise terrorism for a protest campaign that relied on their website and doing things like sending black faxes to drain people's toner cartridges. So obviously, right, the Humane Society is connected to terrorism. Now, an important part of this media campaign, though, is you have to use every single opportunity to get that narrative out. So when a movie like Hoot comes out, it was a really popular kids movie, this was about 10 years ago now, where you have this popular narrative of, kids like animals, kids want to protect animals, kids stop bulldozers to save owls, it's kind of like Free Willy or any of these books and movies. These industry groups sent out press releases saying it was softcore eco-terrorism for kids. And the Houston Chronicle and other media outlets ran headlines like, "Is Hoot softcore eco-terrorism for kids?" Well, we have 2 experts talking about it. So you see how this is working here? It's slowly bubbling its way up. Now, my favorite all-time image related to this is from the National Rifle Association. And you would think the NRA, of all organizations, would support armed groups. I don't know what the connection is. But they had this dossier that they created of all these different threats to the Second Amendment. And one of them was animal rights terrorists. And we begin to see that the true threat posed by these radical groups is they've taught lobsters to crawl on land. They've taught owls to carry dynamite. I have some angry pigs in the background. And I think most damning of all is that the women don't shave their legs. But you can see in the corner that the guys do. Some kind of commentary there. So as all that stuff is happening, alongside of it, there are congressional hearings being held. And the way this works, it's similar to, I think Joseph McCarthy really pioneered the strategy of this. Because when you have these congressional hearings, it's all political theater, right? It's a spectacle. And so you get to do this thing where you say, thank you for joining us all here today. We're here to discuss whether environmentalists are terrorists. And we're going to hear from the FBI, Homeland Security, a bunch of corporations. And what do you know? By the end of the discussion, you have all this evidence and all these people saying, yeah, environmentalists are terrorists. Then it leads to media coverage. You see all the microphones lined up here. If you're in Tony Collins' class about covering the Supreme Court or DC or foreign news, when the government does something, it's news, right? So this makes it a legitimate story. As all that's taking place, step 4 is a really important one within these social movements, and that's to divide them. Now, not to get too nerdy with this, but I think it's helpful to think of it as social movements having both a horizontal and a vertical component, or at least that's how I picture it. So horizontally, you have the environmental movement alongside other progressive social movements, at least in my worldview. So people that are fighting the war or defending refugees or marching for women yesterday or fighting for labor rights, all these different things. These groups don't see eye to eye a lot of times, but for the most part, they're slowly marching in the same general direction. An important strategy has been to say that these protesters who are being targeted aren't like everybody else. They're not part of the capital L left. They're not a real liberal or leftist group. These are environmentalists. They're like trying to save trees. These animal rights people don't want you to have Burger King anymore. It sounds silly, but that narrative is really important to say they're not like you. Don't worry about what's happening to them. Don't worry about them being labeled as terrorists. At the same time, though, you have social movements with this vertical element. So the above ground are groups like the Humane Society, Sierra Club, Greenpeace, ASPCA, right? All the big national groups. The underground groups are some of the photos I showed. The Animal Liberation Front, people who are vandalizing property or getting arrested in a forest. A key strategy historically has been to divide the sections of the movement. So for instance, in my research for my book, I found that there were letters sent to all the major nonprofits that said, unless you came out and publicly condemned both their tactics and the ideology of the more militant groups, their tax status would be investigated. So if you're the head of the Sierra Club, right, it's a huge organization, and you have some members of Congress saying, well, you got to condemn these radicals who are getting arrested and locking their necks to things, or else we're going to investigate you, it's really tempting to do that. And unfortunately, a lot of groups had to do exactly that. So it creates more division, both horizontally and vertically. So in short, when that happens, you have people that are isolated in the middle. If you're isolated from your allies in other movements, and you're isolated within your own social movement, it allows all these attacks to continue much more forcefully. Now, we've seen a lot about surveillance. I mean, just this week with WikiLeaks and the CIA, and this continues to come out. But I don't think people understand the scope of the surveillance used against social movements and how this actually looks in real life. This is an example from the UK, only because I got this great image I can throw up here. The same stuff happens here. This is a guy named Mark Kennedy / Mark Stone. And he traveled around Europe, including attempting to attend multiple conferences that I spoke with. Fortunately, people were already suspicious at that point and rejected him. But you can see Mark the cop on one side, and here's Mark the anarchist with his earring and do-rag and bad skull tattoo and ponytail, the whole starter kit, right? But the serious part of this is Mark Kennedy / Mark Stone was infiltrating these social movements, having sexual relationships with female protesters, really crossing a lot of moral and ethical and legal boundaries, and gathering intelligence that was being fed up to law enforcement. Now, in addition to law enforcement, though, you have the rise after 9/11 of all these third-party spy firms. These are just a couple of them I've found in my work. When you go to their websites of the Inkerman Group or INA or Stratfor, they don't say anything about this stuff. But the people who know them know that they're the ones to call if you want somebody to covertly spy on protesters. So if you're a Monsanto and you're worried about these environmentalists, protesting at your conference, you can collect information on them this way. Now, I even found out about surveillance of my own work in the course of doing this. We talked a little bit earlier when everybody was getting coffee and snacks about how when I was on book tour, I had FBI agents coming to multiple events and showing their badges to try to make a point. But through the Freedom of Information Act, I got some documents that showed surveillance of my speaking events, like this one, lectures and interviews, website posting, articles I've written, emails. This is one, I like that they included my book as like a big display image. And their write-up of it by the counterterrorism unit described it as compelling and well-written. So this is always my, it's a university event, so I'm not selling books. But if the counterterrorism unit likes the book, I'm sure you guys would love it too. It's only $16.95 on Amazon. Now, it's important to know that most people, most protest groups, most individuals are not going to set foot in a courtroom, right? There's an intent to make people afraid that that's going to happen to them, but only a handful of people actually end up in court. But the ones who do, it's really important that they're sentenced disproportionately to send a message to the broader social movement. So here's how this kind of plays out in real life. This is Marius Mason. She destroyed some genetically engineered crops and research, clearly illegal, but didn't harm anyone, just destroyed property. The guy on the right is part of a group of people that went out and beat and ran over with their cars and hit with batons and sticks African Americans who supported President Obama. Marius Mason was sentenced to 22 years in prison under what's called a terrorism enhancement penalty, which has been used really boldly against environmentalists. These guys got between 4.5 and 9 years in prison. 4.5 and 9 years in prison is still no joke, right? I mean, I've done a lot of work with people in prisons. All it takes is a year, less than that, to have really serious long-term consequences. 22 years is staggering. And this is 22 years labeled as a terrorist. So she's in a special prison unit, I'll talk about in a moment, separated from general population. Also through the Freedom of Information Act, we got some documents showing that corporations, in this case TransCanada, the pipeline company, are actually instructing law enforcement about how to sentence these protest groups. So think about this for a moment. This is one of their slides from a PowerPoint presentation where TransCanada agents stand up and you guys get to be the law enforcement in the room. And they say, well, here are the people who are protesting us, including some people I've interviewed repeatedly, Scott Parkin and Ray Bro. And they're a threat to our business, they're radicals, and then they include in some other pages of this presentation instructions on how to prosecute them as terrorists, including what criminal code violations to go after them with, how to surveil them. Let that sink in for a moment. I know it sounds a little, conspiracy theory, whatever, but these are corporations briefing law enforcement about how they should protect corporate profits. That's the evolution that we're seeing right now. What's been absolutely instrumental throughout all of this is that law enforcement has developed informants, or as protesters would say, snitches, to spy on protest groups and to collect information about them. A really notorious example is this young woman codenamed Anna. Anna was a university undergraduate student. She was writing a paper about counterterrorism. She had an FBI agent speak to her class, and she was real gung-ho about getting a job afterwards. So she said, I'm investigating protest groups, like you should use me somehow, we should work together, and they took her up on it. So she traveled the country, she was collecting information about activists, she went to protest. The FBI gave her thousands of dollars to pay for hotel rooms and food and travel expenses. And all the while, with this specific group of people, she was trying to convince them to blow up a dam. And it came out in her wire recordings that she wore the entire time that they weren't going to do it. Eric McDavid, one of the activists, had hopes of a romantic relationship with Anna. She was stringing him along. She was violating FBI protocol about those types of relationships. At one point when she was wired up, she was yelling at them. She was like, do you guys just want to sit around and smoke pot and talk politics all day, or are we going to blow up this dam? And they, to their credit, made the better choice of wanting to smoke pot and talk politics, right? And she was just furious at this. And finally, they just pulled the plug on the investigation. Nothing was happening. Instead, they used conspiracy charges again against this group of activists. They got 3 of the individuals to become government informants and to turn on the other one. That's the dynamic that always happens in these cases. The government just scares the daylights out of people and says, well, if you want to make all this go away, you better provide information to us about these other people. And you're 20 years old, you're terrified about ruining your entire life, you provide information, everybody else gangs up on the one last person. Eric McDavid was sentenced to more than 20 years in prison as a terrorist for traveling the country with an informant and ostensibly not rebuking her strongly enough when she was trying to push him, and he said, no, we're not going to do that. This one of my favorite headlines from the RNC protest a few years ago. The FBI was approaching individuals and trying to get them to become government informants and spy on political activists at vegan potlucks. And to be clear, this is absolutely my dream job here at the University of Michigan, and I want to stay around as long as I can. If that doesn't work out, this would be a runner-up, right? To get paid to go to vegan potlucks. Vegans don't mess around when it comes to food. Like, these are serious undertakings here. But for those of you in the room who have kind of a grounding in these tactics historically, you know that during the 1970s, Dr. King, the Black Panthers, American Indian Movement, Students for a Democratic Society were all surveilled and spied upon, and the FBI went way beyond the law in doing that in a program called COINTELPRO. It was this huge controversy. The government said it was shut down, right? Okay, black period of history, it's over. We found out through the Freedom of Information Act that those same tactics are going on today. In this case was an FBI file where an FBI agent is talking about the possibility of planting rumors within protest groups in order to create the impression that one of them is an informant. So if you don't have an informant, spread a rumor that someone else was and you can do the same damage, right? In part, they note that younger activists are especially susceptible to this because they don't understand the history. And if that's not telling, I really don't know what is here. We talked about the FBI using informants, but now we've seen corporations try to jump into that game as well. So in one case, SeaWorld has been under fire. Have you guys seen Blackfish on CNN? I mean, this really sent this like shockwaves throughout our entire culture. Everyone was talking about animal abuse at SeaWorld, right? It was on CNN, it was a really big deal. SeaWorld stock started plummeting, people are protesting. SeaWorld hires this guy in the back to be an informant to go and get arrested with protesters, taking selfies in the police van, all the while collecting information about them. The culmination of decades of those types of tactics has been the creation of new laws specifically to silence dissent and target specific social movements. I think one of the most important of these in our lifetimes is called the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. This is a piece of legislation that was carved out at the lobbying of groups like this: the Chicken Council, the pork industry, Pfizer, Wyeth, the beef industry, the Kennel Club, egg producers, the list goes on. All with the intent of doing a couple of things. One, the law makes it a terrorism offense to engage in nonviolent civil disobedience, to instill what's called a reasonable fear through your protest activity. Now remember all those black masks I had on from those advertisements. How do you talk about reasonable fear in this climate anymore? The industry is trying to make the unreasonable appear reasonable, but nevertheless, by instilling a reasonable fear, this is a terrorism offense. And on top of that, if you cause a loss of profits to an animal enterprise, that's animal enterprise terrorism. So I've been researching this law for a while. I was invited to testify before Congress against it. And in preparation for that, when I was doing my work, someone anonymously sent me the internal website of the organizations that are lobbying for the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. And being the real good, investigative journalist I am, I entered the username of test and the password of, well, the password was my second, would have been my follow-up. It was test, and it just opens wide up. And you have, I don't know if you can see, under the ACLU and Humane Society, I'm listed as the opposition there. But what's really interesting is over here, you have these congressional scorecards. And those are fascinating, especially if you spent time in DC, because all lobbying groups track their votes. They know exactly when something's coming up for a vote, they know how it's going to go down. What those showed is that this group did not have any votes at all. You know, they had a handful of supporters that are closely tied to these industries, but for the most part, nobody cared about this. So what they did was really brilliant in a lot of ways. As opposition was building to this, they used an obscure procedure called suspension of the rules. This is how a lot of bills get moved through Washington, D.C. that are ostensibly non-controversial. So that same week, the procedure was used to honor the St. Louis Cardinals for winning the World Series. It was used to rename a bridge in Delaware after the guy who created the Roth IRA, you know, pressing national concerns. And then it was used to pass the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. There were only 6 members of Congress in the room. The rest of the House and the Senate were on the National Mall breaking ground on a new memorial honoring Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Now, just to hit that point home a little bit harder here, this is a guy who broke the law repeatedly, using nonviolent civil disobedience. That was a cornerstone of his activism, how he enacted change. In other words, that type of activity is worthy of a national monument as long as it's 30 years in the past. But if you use those same tactics today in the name of the environment or protecting animals, that's labeled as terrorism. Now, when I testified, speaking of that political theater, you know, I was told I could raise some minor objections to the bill, but to keep in mind that it had bipartisan support. I was like, okay, no problem. And I proceeded to compare it to the Red Scare and McCarthyism. So I don't think I'm going to be invited back to ever testify before Congress anytime soon. But when I did, it got really heated really fast. And the members of the committee were like, Mr. Potter, you don't know what you're talking about. These laws aren't targeting protests. They're not targeting civil disobedience. This is about terrorism. Do you support burning things down? I'm like, no, but I support the Constitution. And so it just went on like that for a while. Nevertheless, look what we found. FBI files from before this legislation was even introduced describing the FBI considering terrorism prosecutions for nonviolent undercover investigators using the previous version of the law. On top of that, the very first prosecution under the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act was not for firebombing, it was not for murder, or even for breaking windows. It was a group of activists in California who chalked slogans on the sidewalk using children's sidewalk chalk outside of animal experimenters' homes. That was it. Now, if you think of most governments throughout history that have gone too far, that have overstepped their bounds in attempting to silence dissent or opposition views, I think most of the time the images come to mind of special prison units and secret prisons. Unfortunately, similar units have been constructed at home in the United States. They are called Communications Management Units, or CMUs. These are facilities that explicitly prohibit the press. As far as I know, I'm still the only journalist who's ever been inside of them. I was able to visit because, well, I shouldn't say too much about that, but I was able to visit one of the prisoners. We were corresponding, we had a long relationship. So I was able to visit as a friend. And I gave a TED talk about this that's much longer and more in detail. But the short summary of these CMUs is they were created secretly and illegally to house people with, quote, inspirational significance. They're, right? Orwell would love that. The majority of people who are housed here are Muslim prisoners, but they're not the Zacharias Mousawis or the 9/11 hijackers of the world. These are people who have violated the economic sanctions on Iraq by sending medical supplies to the children there. They're nonviolent offenders for the most part. In addition to that, there are a handful of environmentalists and animal rights activists that were transferred into the CMUs. These are all white activists to create the illusion of some kind of racial parity. These facilities were being charged in court by the ACLU as being discriminatory, so that's why you had some of these environmentalists thrown in there as well. Their communication is cut off with the outside world. They're not allowed any contact visits. They're not able to hug their wife or their children or their family members. When I visited Daniel McGowan, one of these environmental prisoners, we were in this tiny room with a little CCTV camera on the ceiling that was live monitored by the counterterrorism unit in Virginia. Had bulletproof glass behind us. The room is so small you can put your arms out. And it's just radically restricting their communication. A handful of minutes a month, a handful of hours on the phone, compared to even some of the most dangerous prisoners in the country at ADX Florence in Colorado, the Supermax. Now, when I began this work, and specifically focusing on how protest is labeled as terrorism, the majority of people being targeted were those who engaged in some kind of questionable activity, right? They're locking their necks to bulldozers, or they're doing something that's getting arrested. Increasingly, though, I think the final step of this effort is to expand that legal precedent to more and more mainstream groups. So I think this is a pretty telling example. The FBI gives these training presentations to new FBI agents in which they instruct them about the FBI's priorities. We got this one through the Freedom of Information Act again, in which we see that the FBI is instructing that the true threat of so-called eco-terrorism doesn't have anything to do with violence or the threat of violence. It's all framed in terms of information in media. Public relations war, media is vital part of every action. Sometimes they even use celebrities, and God forbid, every once in a while, the media is sometimes slanted in their favor. I should also note that as I'm showing all these FBI documents, some of the students I'm working with here on campus through the Europe program, say hi, Lena and Pranav, are helping me, and we also have, again, some funding through the Marsh program. We're filing hundreds of Freedom of Information Act requests, looking for some similar information, but specifically focused on surveillance of journalists. So using that initial information about me as a starting point, and then bringing my colleagues into the project as well. One thing that I never thought would have been possible, though, from the outset of this, is that some of the most mainstream above-ground organizations in the country, like the Humane Society, could be criminalized. Now there's an effort underway at the state level that are called ag-gag laws. Ag is for agriculture, and gag is to silence. These laws have passed in about 7 states. There's one being debated right now in Arkansas. They vary in different ways, but all of them criminalize photography and video recordings. Some of them specifically single out journalists, criminalize distribution on social media, any type of footage of factory farms or slaughterhouses that the industry doesn't want the public to see. I'm happy to say that I was a plaintiff in the first constitutional lawsuit challenging these laws. We had a host of journalism organizations signed on as amici, submitting letters to the court, and we had it struck down as unconstitutional. But now the government's appealing, and all these bills are moving in other states as well. All of this has been in response to really damning footage. I mean, it's, again, not about law breaking. It's about who has access to information and what the public image is being portrayed about these industries. Oh, let's get past that real fast. Now again, the industry promised this has nothing to do with people who are just taking photographs. This is about terrorism. If you look at the legislative history around the country, they repeatedly say, terrorism, 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 we have to go after terrorists. The first woman prosecuted under ag-gag is named Amy Meyer, and she was just filming from a public street in Utah. She saw a sick cow being pushed by a bulldozer outside of a slaughterhouse, and she did what any of us would in the age of this, right? She just pulled it out and started filming. It's not even that great footage, right? And for that, she was arrested and charged. I wrote about her story. It got such national and international media attention in 24 hours, got picked up by the LA Times, Washington Post, all these different places, that the prosecution just said, forget it, and they dropped all the charges. Now, of course, I lied in my BuzzFeed listicle presentation here, that there's not just 10 steps to how all this happens. The most important point to leave you all with is that there's this unspoken final step, which is to repeat the entire thing over again against different political groups based on their ideologies. So right now, the main target has been environmentalist animal rights groups. But my message to you all is that it doesn't matter if you care about those causes at all. That's not what this is about. I'm obviously sympathetic to them, you can tell by my jokes and whatever. But even if you don't care about the environment, you don't care about animals, this still affects everybody in this room. We've seen this spread of this rhetoric to more and more social movements. In one of these presentations by the FBI, anarchists who have been affiliated with Occupy Wall Street, they did relief efforts after Hurricane Sandy in New York, even to the point where the National Guard was relying on anarchist groups to distribute information and supplies. They're described as criminals seeking an ideology to justify their activities. Think about that for a moment. An entire belief system that in this country has advocated for child labor laws, against the, in favor of the 5-hour work week, all that stuff. Criminals in search of an ideology. Now, with the rise of groups like Black Lives Matter, doing things like mass protests that are shutting down highways, we're seeing legislation introduced across the country this session that's specifically targeting these activists in the exact same way that environmentalists have been targeted for decades. In Washington State, one bill describes blocking the highway as economic terrorism. Another one, I believe this was in Tennessee, allows for restitution if there's a loss of profits from businesses based on these protests. Yet another, and I'm drawing a blank on the state, says that, well, if you run somebody over in your car and they're blocking the highway like Black Lives Matter does, you can't be held responsible. So who knows if any of these are going to get passed, but that message is clear. It's sending a chill. I've been fortunate in my work to travel a lot internationally, especially as these tactics are showing up in other countries. This is a flyer from Austria, where ag-gag style legislation is appearing there. I was also down in Australia for a month, speaking about how US-style ag-gag laws were being copied and pasted in the Australian political system. So in other words, under neoliberalism and global capitalism, corporations don't have any boundaries, right? We all know this. They can go wherever they need to for profit. With them, they can take these types of tactics to go after their opposition. Fortunately, we were able to shut down the ag-gag bills in Australia. I met with Australian Parliament. They're really supportive. They didn't want to be like the United States. And I was like, you're right, you don't want to be like the United States. Similarly, I'm going to speak at the Council of Europe this summer, which is great, but it's because they also don't want to be like the United States. This is a gathering of 300 Supreme Court judges from around Europe, and the topic is how this idea of environmental terrorism is being taken up by governments throughout Europe, described in Europol police reports as the #1 threat as well. Now, a quick update. There's a lot I could say about the Trump administration, and my students hear about it all the time, especially in regards to the threat to the free press. But some of the two things I wanted to highlight, in the first weeks of the administration, the US Department of Agriculture stripped all publicly available information from its website, citing the potential threat of animal rights extremists, right? They could use knowledge to influence public opinion and protest. So all of that information was taken off the site. And then another really important story that hasn't gotten nearly as much attention is there's a program within government called CVE, or Countering Violent Extremism. This is how, it's a very flawed program, but it's how law enforcement agencies and policymakers kind of think about domestic terrorism and how it spreads. And the new administration has officially removed white supremacist and white nationalist groups from the Countering Violent Extremism program. This quote at the top is from the Daily Stormer, which is a white nationalist website. The founder said after this happened that President Trump is setting us free. Now, this is always the question every time I give a talk, right? I mean, this is why I also do children's birthday parties, bar mitzvahs, whatever you need. But the question is always, all right, thank you for this wonderful afternoon, but what are we supposed to do with all this stuff, right? And the short answer is I don't know. The longer answer is that I started doing this work because of this question. I was seeing people that I knew, sources of mine going to prison, friends of mine being sentenced to prison as a terrorist. I had very minimal encounter with the FBI. I mean, I had that one arrest. But still, I saw this and I felt like there's nothing I could do about it. I'm a journalist. I could write about it. I can speak okay. So that's what I started doing. And the message I wanted to leave you all with, this is from the Sea Shepherds in Antarctica. They sent me a cool little promo photo when they're bored on the water with icebergs in the background reading my book. But the reason I love the photo is, to me, that's the message of what all this is about. That I'm not just reporting on this stuff. It's not a historical narrative. This is happening right now. So no matter what issues you do care about, if you're an environmentalist or not, or you care about refugee groups, and it doesn't matter. You have to use this information with action to be out there engaging in a democracy. The point of all these tactics is to make people afraid. And I think there's a danger even in lectures like this of enhancing that fear. If you all leave this room just absolutely terrified of everything I've described and saying, I don't want to be on a terrorist list, I'm not going to do anything. Well, that's exactly what the intention is. So you have to use this information in a political contemporary context. One of the most inspiring examples I've seen of that around these ag-gag bills is all these groups that normally don't have anything together, to put it mildly, in common I mean, or at worst are actively at each other's throats all the time, have united to stop this legislation. Groups like Amnesty International, the ACLU, you have animal groups in there, you have lawyers groups, whistleblowers, Teamsters, because workers are affected, you have labor unions. To me, this is beautiful. I mean, it's saying that it doesn't matter where you fall on this spectrum or maybe someplace outside of it, that you have a stake in this because it affects everyone. The only way I can possibly explain how we reconcile those images I started my presentation with, people actually breaking the law or setting fires or whatever, to groups who are just taking photographs, is that there's been a profound shift in this country of how these social movements are operating and how they're gaining power. And I would argue that the reason that these political activists are a threat today, and the same goes for Black Lives Matter and other social justice movements as well, it's not that they're breaking windows, it's that they're creating them. They're shining a spotlight on abuse, whether it's police violence that's recorded with a cell phone camera, or an activist going into a factory farm and showing consumers how animal products are truly raised. All of those things are a direct threat to vested political interest. And that's how we explain all of this harsh crackdown. So if anything, this is my attempt to twist this around to a positive note. You see what I'm doing here? That none of this would be happening unless they were incredibly effective. A handful of people, I mean literally a handful of people who have very little money, very little resources, have terrified the most powerful corporations on the planet through photos and video and civil disobedience. To me, that's inspiring. And I hope, regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum or if you care at all of these social movements, you recognize both that power and the threat that's posed by allowing people to silence their political opposition in a democracy. So in that spirit, thank you all for having me. I know I went over time, but hopefully we have time for a couple questions.
Anybody with a question? Go back. We have a mic, so if you wait until the mic
You mentioned the government's attempt to silence groups like the Sierra Club and NRDC if they didn't come out and discredit the activists. What did the Sierra Club and NRDC specifically do in the face of that threat?
Unfortunately, a lot of groups sent out public statements both to members of Congress and to the press denouncing, perceived radical groups. And again, both in terms of what they were doing, like getting arrested, or of what they believed. They wanted to establish themselves, trust us, we're mainstream, we're not a threat. And it didn't really work. NRDC did that. I don't know if Sierra Club sent out a letter, but they made press statements. Nevertheless, they've still been harassed. I don't recall if Sierra Club specifically sent out a letter. I believe they did, yeah. If you email me, I'll look through my notes and make sure which did which. But it sent the message, right? I mean, it's still that top level fear. What's interesting though, you know, flash forward a few years, groups like the Sierra Club were engaged for the first time in its history in nonviolent civil disobedience outside the White House. So, you know, it's unfortunate all this happened, but still they came back around eventually and said, with the ecological crisis we're facing, this organization for the very first time is going to have people get arrested at the White House.
Anybody else?
I have a lot of questions. One of the things that I was surprised that you didn't mention is about the political parties involved. I think I'm right. Oh, okay. That you did not mention political parties that, and this is something that maybe I should say what you can do is at least to be aware that it doesn't really matter if you lean to the right or the left in terms of political parties.
Right.
Because these things involve Democratic administrations as well as Republican administrations. Things would not have been really much better if we had Al Gore or if we had Hillary Clinton elected, because these all occurred during Democratic administrations as well.
That's right.
A lot of this happened in 1992, I remember.
Right, and you know, President Obama when he was a senator, made really powerful statements against some of these congressional hearings. I mean, lockstep in terms of talking points with everything I'm saying about, you know, can't demonize people because of their political beliefs. We already have crimes against these things. It's making people afraid. When he became president, you know, priorities shift. Again, with the Trump administration, you know, I try to avoid speaking in a specifically partisan way, in part because after being in Washington, D.C. for 15 years, you kind of start to see that no matter who is in charge of the hearing, you know, business interests are still protected. And I think that's the takeaway here. Also, I should add, it's not partisan in the sense that we should remember that just because more left-leaning groups are being targeted now, that's not set in stone. You know, if you're more on the conservative side of the spectrum, there's no guarantee all of this legal precedent will not be twisted around and used against groups that you care about. Now, I do a lot of interviews on like far right-wing radio and TV and stuff like that, and I'm always shocked of how well it goes. Because they'll say, you know, they'll kind of take petty jabs and say, oh, you're a hippie and blah, blah, blah. But they'll say, on this point, you're right, that we can't let the government go this far because it puts us at risk. And I think that has to be the takeaway. Yeah.
For the recording,
regarding the passage of the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, how aware do you think all the rest of the members of Congress were of that?
There's very little awareness. And that was part of the motivation of why that procedure was used. You know, even within sympathetic groups, I mean, I was the only witness to testify against it. No national groups wanted to speak out. And I was on the phone talking to other groups and saying, hey, did you guys know this is happening? Like, can you comment on it? And they said, oh, we have no idea. So information was building, awareness was building, and that's why it was pushed through. Similarly, on the Hill in DC, most members of Congress had no idea this was taking place. A few did. I mean, Bobby Scott, the chair of the committee, when I testified, is really a great guy on civil liberties issues for the most part, but he was a co-sponsor. So of those that were paying attention, they saw Bobby Scott, he's a civil rights champion. They're like, well, if Bobby Scott supports this, all right, that's fine, and they just let it through.
okay, anybody else?
Thanks for a great talk.
I think so.
You've been able to get attention to some of these issues, but we all know one of the big problems is that news organizations are owned by corporations too, and you're probably well versed on the story about a Fox News investigative team in Florida years ago that tried to investigate, bovine growth hormone in cows, and this story, when Brass in New York got word that this story was coming down and was going to make Florida dairy big business look bad, it got censored from the top down, and the investigative journalists found out that Monsanto's lawyers had actually been trying to squelch the story. So journalists are under a lot of pressure, not just in this area, but in other kinds of areas. And I'm just curious if you personally or colleagues you could talk about have found yourself kind of getting pressure in that direction, not to do your work as you would as a professional.
That's a great point. You know, I've had very little issues with that kind of direct, heavy-handed, top-down from an editor or publisher directing my work. I mean, it happened once at the Tribune. That was really the only time in my career. But there are also systematic tensions and pressures that make those stories difficult to get out as well. So even if you don't have a company like Monsanto or whoever coming to the newsroom, you know, newsrooms are cutting back budgets radically. There's just not money for investigative reporting. Most journalists are being asked to do a lot of stories in one day rather than, you know, actually delve into one. So if people aren't familiar with these issues, you know, you rely on the headline, you rely on the soundbite, get it out the door. That's part of the problem. And then I've felt a real institutional pressure to not be too critical on terrorism policies. Remember, this was all starting around September 11th. And, you know, I look fine on paper. I've got all the credentials and all the press clips, and I could just not get these stories placed. And I'm like, it was driving me crazy. And even the more recent ones, like that Amy Meyer story, I was talking to my friend, the features editor at the Washington Post. I was like, you guys should break this. This is going to be national news. Like, I wasn't even negotiating money and all. I was just like, let me do the story. And they wouldn't run with it. And then, but they would use me as a source to talk about my work in another story, if that makes sense. So that's a long way of saying, I think independent journalism is filling a void in terms of investigative reporting. It allows people like me a lot more freedom to do that work, but it comes at the expense of institutional protection. And increasingly, especially under this administration, that is my number one concern, given the stuff I do, of, you know, it's one thing to get these stories out, but unless you have, when you have the New York Times being labeled as fake news, you know, I'm a drop in the bucket. All these other investigative journalists, you know, nobody pays attention to us. So I think it's a complex dynamic. You know, there's part of that top-down pressure, but then you learn very quickly, especially living in DC, that yeah, you got to ask some tough questions to get ahead, but you also got to know when to stop asking tough questions, right? You don't want to get a reputation as being like an agenda-driven reporter, which could just mean you're pushing it really hard. You know, when I was in DC, I used to go and kind of haunt people like Rumsfeld after the morning shows, because, you know, they'd do all the morning talk shows on Sunday, and then they'd come out, there's a gaggle of press, and they'd all give them softball questions, and I'd show up, and I'd be like, so tell me about war crimes in Iraq. It was interesting, the dynamic from the other journalists. They're like, this isn't how you're supposed to do it. So I don't know if that answered your question, but I think it's all of those things together.
Well, similarly to that, there's been, Edward Snowden talked about when he was being interviewed by John Oliver, how much effect his leaks had, and then with the Panama Papers being quickly blown up and then brushed over. You kind of spoke to it, but do you or fellow journalists get discouraged when pieces that you feel are so important get brushed under the rug and don't make your front pages, and then how do you combat that and still break the story when there's, like you said, Upworthy and BuzzFeed, who are churning out 10 articles a day that people are sharing on Facebook, but not getting to the real news?
Well, that's a great question, and one I struggle with constantly, because like on those secret prisons investigations, you know, I'd done all this work, I'd gotten into the prison, gotten documents about it. To me, this is one of the defining stories post 9/11, right? And I just couldn't get any traction with it. Eventually NPR and some other places did something, but it just kind of landed with a thud. And that's part of why I went to TED. I was doing that fellowship. I'm like, well, let's try this as a platform. So yes, there is that frustration all the time, because I don't know, especially in my work, I don't want to turn to those types of gimmicky devices to get people to read this, while at the same time, people got to read this. So how do you balance that? And how do you maintain your credibility without pushing that too far, or on the other end of things, becoming an advocate and being kind of pigeonholed in that way, which is a big concern with my work too, that I have to fight so hard to get these stories out. It necessitates taking a more advocacy position. I'm just advocating the Constitution in my mind, but in the minds of the opposition, they see me as, advocating for animal rights extremists or terrorists or whatever. So I don't know. I don't know what the solution to that is. I mean, I think newsrooms are constantly struggling with it. You're seeing places like CNN and the Washington Post on their Facebook feeds, on stories they're promoting, they're using those types of headlines, like such and such happened at the Michigan League. You won't believe what happened next. I'm like, come on, man. And so I think we have to start talking about what is that doing to us as a culture in terms of our intellectual ability to engage with serious materials without being kind of coddled into it. But I certainly don't have the answer to that. And I do a lot of the gimmicky stuff sometimes too, because you have to.
Okay, then with that, please join me in thanking.
Thank you all so much. Thank you very much.